Scratch-off dust was still wedged under my fingernails when the semi-truck obliterated my car. My final memory wasn't my life flashing before my eyes. It was the metallic tang of blood and the crushing realization that my mother-in-law had swapped my winning lottery ticket for a dud. Then I woke up. Same sticky linoleum floor. Same suffocating reek of her cheap lavender aerosol. I was back. Only this time, I wasn't holding a golden ticket. I was holding a trap. The first thing that hit me was the smell. Acrid, bitter. The unmistakable stench of cheap white bread turned to charcoal in a rusted toaster. My lungs expanded, pulling in the stale air of the cramped kitchen, and I choked. I coughed so hard my ribs ached. Gripping the edge of the Formica countertop, it was sticky. Everything in this house was always slightly sticky, coated in a microscopic layer of aerosol cooking spray and neglect. Oh, for God's sake, Claire, you're hacking like a coal miner. Cover your mouth. You're getting germs near my coffee. The voice was a cheese grater against my eardrums. I squeezed my eyes shut, dizzy with a sudden, violent wave of nausea. I knew that voice. I had heard it screaming at me from the hospital waiting room as I bled out on a gurney. "She's fine. She's faking it," it had said. I opened my eyes. Brenda, my mother-in-law. She was sitting at the wobbly kitchen table, wrapped in a faded pink terrycloth robe that smelled like wet dog and Virginia Slims. Her acrylic nails, painted a chipped, garish red, clicked rhythmically against a ceramic mug. I wasn't dead. I wasn't in the twisted, smoking wreckage of my Honda Civic on Interstate 95. I was standing in the kitchen of the duplex I paid for, looking at the woman who had effectively murdered me for $30 million. My knees buckled. I caught myself on the fridge handle. The metallic cold grounded me. "Are you hungover?" A second voice. David, my husband. He shuffled into the kitchen, scratching his stomach through a stained white t-shirt. He didn't look at me. He never really looked at me. Not unless he needed a cosigner or a clean shirt. He went straight for the burnt toast, scraping the black crust off into the sink with a butter knife. The scraping sound set my teeth on edge. I stared at the calendar tacked to the corkboard beside the fridge. October 14th. My chest tightened, a cold fist squeezing my heart. October 14th. Exactly 1 week before the mega draw. 1 week before, I would stop at the corner bodega on a whim, buy a ticket with the leftover change from David's beer run, and win the jackpot. 1 week before Brenda would find the ticket in my coat pocket, memorize the numbers, replace it with a losing ticket from the trash, and claim the prize herself while kicking me out onto the street with David's secret, crippling gambling debts. "I asked you a question, Claire," David mumbled around a mouthful of dry toast. Crumbs fell onto his chin. "You didn't make my lunch." I looked at him, the man I had defended to my friends, the man I had worked double shifts to support. His hairline was receding, his jawline soft and weak. He looked pathetic. I felt a sudden, terrifying urge to laugh. It bubbled up in the back of my throat, tasting like bile and adrenaline. "I'm not feeling well," I managed to say. My voice sounded foreign, thinner, scraped raw. Brenda scoffed, rolling her eyes toward the water-stained ceiling. "She's not feeling well, Davy. Means she wants to lay in bed all day while you break your back at the dealership. I told you she was lazy." I didn't argue. In my past life, I would have apologized. I would have scrambled to pack his turkey sandwich, desperate for a crumb of approval. I would have swallowed the humiliation like dry pills. Now, I just looked at her, really looked at her. I saw the deep lines around her mouth, etched by years of chronic dissatisfaction. I saw the greedy, frantic dart of her eyes as she scanned the kitchen, always looking for something to take, something to consume. She was a parasite, and I had been her host. "I'm going to work," I said flatly. I turned and walked back to our bedroom. I didn't run. I forced my legs to move steadily, smoothly, even though every muscle in my body was twitching with a primal, terrified energy. I closed the bedroom door, locked it. I sank to the floor at the foot of the bed, burying my face in my hands. The carpet was rough against my forehead. I breathed in the smell of dust mites and old laundry. I was alive. The sheer impossibility of it was a crushing weight. I remembered the blinding headlights, the sound of glass shattering into a million diamonds, the tearing of metal. My hands were shaking violently. I held them up, staring at my intact skin. No glass embedded in the knuckles, no blood pooling under the cuticles. I could leave right now. I could pack a duffel bag, drain the joint checking account of its measly $300, and drive west. But then what? David had already put my name on 3 different payday loans. The paperwork was in his glove compartment. I had found it too late last time. If I left, they would ruin my credit, bury me in legal fees, and drag me down anyway. Besides, just walking away felt hollow. It felt like letting a rabid dog off a leash in a crowded park. They would just find another victim. Or worse, they would skate through life, untouched, oblivious to the blood on their hands. A slow, dark realization settled in my gut, cooling the panic. I knew the winning numbers. I knew the exact sequence that would drop on October 21st. But if I bought it and hid it, Brenda would just tear the house apart looking for it. She always snooped. It was a compulsion. She didn't just want money. She wanted my money. She wanted the satisfaction of taking it from me. I stood up, my knees popping in the quiet room. I walked over to the dresser and looked at myself in the cheap, warped mirror. Pale skin, dark circles under my eyes, hair pulled back into a messy knot. I looked exhausted. I looked like a victim. Perfect. I didn't need to hide a winning ticket. I needed to leave one right out in the open. The corner bodega smelled like old mop water, incense, and the faint, sweet decay of overripe plantains. It was raining outside, a cold, miserable autumn drizzle that soaked through the shoulders of my trench coat. I stood at the counter, listening to the heavy thrum of the rain against the glass door. Arthur, the owner, was half asleep on his stool behind the plexiglass barrier, an old portable TV murmuring in the background. "Just a coffee, Claire?" he asked, his voice gravelly. "And a lottery ticket, Arthur. The mega draw for the 21st. He raised a bushy eyebrow, ringing up the black coffee. "You don't play. David plays. You always yell at him for wasting the money." "Feeling lucky today," I said. My voice didn't shake. It was a dead, flat calm that frightened me a little. I bought 5 tickets. I chose my own numbers. Back in my car, parked under the flickering yellow glow of a broken street lamp, I went to work. The rain, drumming on the roof, muffled the sound of my ragged breathing. I turned on the dome light. It cast harsh shadows across the dashboard. I had stopped at a craft store on my lunch break. Sitting on the passenger seat was a small paper bag containing a precision hobby knife, a bottle of matte adhesive, and a high-grade, fine-tip pen. I took the 5 tickets and spread them on my lap. The winning numbers for the 21st were burned into my retinas, a sequence of digits that had haunted my dying moments. 08, 14, 22, 39, 41, and the mega ball 07. I didn't have to forge the whole ticket. I just had to alter a few digits on one of the losing slips to make it look like the winning sequence. It didn't need to pass a scanner. It didn't need to fool the lottery commission. It just needed to pass the eye test of a greedy, chain-smoking woman snooping through my purse in a dim hallway. My fingers were stiff, clumsy, with cold. I turned up the car heater. It blasted dry, dusty air onto my shins. I clamped down on my bottom lip until I tasted copper, steadying my hands. Using the hobby knife, I carefully, agonizingly scraped away the ink from the printed numbers on the third ticket. The paper was slightly porous, and if I pressed too hard, it would tear. I held my breath, scraping a 3 into a blank space, shaving off the curved edge of a 6 to make it a 0. The silence in the car was absolute, broken only by the scrape of the tiny blade and the frantic thudding of my own heart. It took me nearly 2 hours. My neck was screaming with tension, a hot wire of pain radiating down my spine. When I was done, I used the fine-tip pen to fill in the gaps, matching the faded black ink of the machine print. I held it up to the dome light. 08, 14, 22, 39, 41, 07. It wasn't perfect. If you held it an inch from your face and squinted, you could see the slight bruising of the paper, the microscopic difference in the ink's sheen. But Brenda wouldn't hold it an inch from her face. Brenda wore cheap reading glasses she bought from the pharmacy and drank a box of white Zinfandel every night. She would see the numbers, compare them to the TV screen, and her brain would flood with so much dopamine she'd go temporarily blind to anything else. I folded the ticket once, right down the middle, creating a sharp crease. I slid it into the side pocket of my leather purse, leaving just a 1/4 inch of the distinctive pink and white edge peeking out over the zipper. Visible, accessible. I drove home. The streets were slick, reflecting the red tail lights of the cars ahead of me like streaks of blood on wet asphalt. When I walked through the front door, the apartment was quiet. David was asleep on the couch, the TV illuminating his face in a blue, flickering pallor. A half-eaten plate of pizza crusts sat on his chest, rising and falling with his snores. I walked past him, my shoes squeaking faintly on the linoleum. I hung my purse on the brass hook in the hallway, right next to the bathroom door, Brenda's prime loitering spot. I went into the bedroom, shut the door, and lay down on top of the covers, fully clothed. I didn't sleep. I lay there for hours, staring at the ceiling, listening. Around 2 a.m., the floorboards in the hallway groaned. I held my breath. The air in the bedroom felt suddenly heavy, pressing down on my chest. Creak. The sound of the bathroom door opening. A pause. The toilet didn't flush. The sink didn't run. There was a faint, barely perceptible rustle. Leather rubbing against fabric. The microscopic sound of a zipper teeth separating, inch by careful inch. My heart was beating so violently, I thought it might crack my ribs. I dug my fingernails into my palms, forcing my breathing to remain slow and even, terrified she would hear me through the thin walls. Rustle, then silence, a long, suffocating silence that stretched into eternity. Finally, a sharp intake of breath from the hallway, a gasp, not of pain, but of shock. It was the sound of a starving animal finding a carcass. I closed my eyes in the dark, a cold, grim smile stretching across my face. The hook was set. The shift in the apartment's atmosphere was immediate and aggressive. I woke up the next morning to the smell of bacon. Real, thick-cut bacon. Not the cheap, paper-thin strips David usually bought. I walked into the kitchen, rubbing my eyes, playing the part of the tired, oblivious wife. Brenda was standing by the stove, humming. She wasn't wearing her crusty pink robe. She was wearing a silk kimono, emerald green, brand new, the tag still sitting on the counter. Her hair was curled, and she smelled of a new, overpowering perfume that smelled like synthetic orchids and heavy musk. "Morning, Claire," she chirped. I stopped in my tracks. She hadn't said good morning to me in 3 years. She usually referred to me as her or the roommate when speaking to David. "Morning," I muttered, moving toward the coffee pot. I checked the hook in the hallway out of the corner of my eye. My purse was zipped completely shut. I didn't need to look inside to know the ticket was gone. David walked in, looking bewildered but pleased. He was wearing a new watch. It caught the harsh fluorescent kitchen light, a bulky, gold-plated monstrosity that looked ridiculously heavy on his pale wrist. "Mom's making breakfast," David said, stating the obvious, staring at the bacon with hungry, glassy eyes. "She said we're celebrating." "Celebrating what?" I asked, keeping my tone perfectly flat. I poured my coffee. It was a new blend, too. Expensive. French roast. The smell of it was rich and oily. Brenda waved a spatula in the air. A smug, tight smile plastered across her face. "Oh, just life, honey. Just realizing that things are finally turning around for this family. You know, David's sister, Chloe, is coming over later. We're going looking at some property." I paused, coffee mug halfway to my mouth. "Property? Brenda, the rent on this place is due next week. We don't have down payment money." Brenda let out a sharp, high-pitched laugh that grated against my skull. It was the laugh of someone who thought they held a royal flush. "Don't you worry your little head about money, Claire. David and I have it all figured out. We came into a little windfall, an early inheritance from an old friend. It's confidential." I looked at David. He puffed out his chest, adjusting the ridiculous gold watch. "Yeah, Claire, I told you I was making moves. You just need to trust me. In fact, you can probably quit that awful receptionist job soon. I'll be taking care of things from now on." The audacity of it was a physical blow. They hadn't won yet. The drawing wasn't until Friday. But they had the ticket. They had the numbers, and they believed it was a foregone conclusion. They were already spending it. "An inheritance," I repeated softly. "That's wonderful." I took a sip of the coffee. It tasted like ash, but I forced it down. By Wednesday, the apartment looked like a chaotic staging ground for a tacky reality show. Chloe, David's sister, had arrived like a hurricane of entitlement. She was a younger, louder version of Brenda, smelling of self-tanner and stale Prosecco. I came home from work to find the living room crammed with shopping bags. Designer logos stared back at me from the worn carpet. Prada, Gucci, Neiman Marcus. Chloe was draped across my armchair, scrolling through her phone. "Claire, make yourself useful and get me a sparkling water, would you? The fridge is packed. I can't find anything." I stood in the doorway, my wet umbrella dripping onto the linoleum. "Get it yourself, Chloe," Chloe gasped, dropping her phone into her lap. Brenda marched out of the kitchen, her face flushed with wine. She was wearing a heavy gold chain around her neck that I knew cost more than my car. Don't speak to my daughter that way in my house, Brenda snapped, her voice slurring slightly at the edges. My name is on the lease, Brenda, I said quietly, gripping the handle of my umbrella until my knuckles turned white. Not for long, David sneered, emerging from the hallway. He was holding a stack of glossy brochures. Luxury cars, Porsches. We're buying a house in the hills. Cash. Mom is finalizing the bridge loans tomorrow to get us through the week until the inheritance clears. My ears rang. Bridge loans. Loans? I asked, feigning panic. David, you can't take out loans based on an uncleared inheritance. What did you use for collateral? David laughed. A nasty, cruel sound. Don't act like a financial advisor, Claire. Mom used this duplex. She forged your signature on the title transfer. It was easy. We took out a massive equity line. We also maxed out your credit cards. Found them in your drawer. The air in the room vanished. I stared at him, my mouth slightly open. I hadn't planned for that. I had left the cards in the drawer, but I hadn't expected them to commit blatant felony fraud before the drawing even happened. The initial shock melted into a cold, terrifying euphoria. I had wanted them to dig a hole. They were currently renting an excavator. You forged my signature, I whispered, letting my voice tremble. I backed up against the door frame, pulling my coat tighter around myself. Brenda stepped forward, her eyes glittering with malice. Oh, stop whining. You'll be fine. We'll pay it off next week and give you a little severance package when David files for divorce. You really thought he was going to stay with a deadweight like you when he's a multi-millionaire? There it was. The ugly, rotting truth, laid bare on a Wednesday afternoon, among piles of Gucci bags. They were going to throw me away, just like last time. Only this time, they weren't killing me in a staged accident. They were just going to leave me ruined, or so they thought. Divorce, I said, letting a tear slip down my cheek. I wiped it away quickly. I see. Pack a bag, Claire, David said, entirely devoid of empathy. He looked at me like I was a piece of trash that had blown onto his new shoes. You can stay at a motel until Sunday. We need the space. Chloe's moving in her stuff so the movers can pack it all up for the new mansion. I looked at the three of them. Brenda, practically vibrating with smug superiority. Chloe, smirking behind her phone. David, weak and cruel, high on a delusion of grandeur. Okay, I said softly. I went to the bedroom. I didn't pack clothes. I packed my birth certificate, my passport, and the hidden folder of financial documents I had copied 3 days ago, proving the accounts were tampered with while I was at work. I walked out the front door into the rain. I didn't look back. I didn't need to. Friday was in 2 days, and Friday was going to be spectacular. The Motel 6 on Highway 40 smelled like industrial bleach and desperate decisions. I sat on the edge of a mattress that sagged heavily in the middle, staring at the flickering red neon light bleeding through the gap in the blackout curtains. It bathed the cheap wood-paneled walls in a hellish, rhythmic glow. Bzzzt, bzzzt. The sound of the sign outside was a physical vibration in my teeth. I pulled my knees to my chest and opened the banking app on my phone. The screen's glare burned my tired eyes. I hadn't slept properly since I left the duplex. Every time I closed my eyes, I heard the screech of tires and felt the crushing weight of metal against my ribcage. The joint account was a bloodbath. My thumb hovered over the transaction history. I had to force myself to breathe through my nose, slow and deep, to keep the nausea at bay. They weren't just spending. They were hemorrhaging money with the frantic, manic energy of people who believed consequences no longer existed. Date merchant, creditor amount charged. Status Oct 17 O'Leary Motors, deposit $15,000. 00 pending Oct 17 Saks, 5th Avenue, 4320, 55 cleared. Oct 18, the Capitol Grill, 845 Uters, cleared. Oct 18, Platinum Title and Loan, 50,000 dined. Guy, disbursed. OCT 19 Elite Moving, 12,500. Pending $50,000. Brenda had leveraged the duplex, the only asset I actually owned, before David manipulated his way onto the deed, to the absolute hilt. She had taken out a high-interest bridge loan from a strip mall lender who asked 0 questions as long as the collateral was real. A heavy, jagged lump formed in my throat. I swallowed hard, tasting stale tap water and copper. For a split second, a terrifying wave of doubt washed over me. This was my credit, my name, my financial life, being dragged into a wood chipper. Could I really fix this? I had the fraud evidence in a manila envelope sitting on the rickety nightstand, but the legal battle would be a nightmare. Am I going too far? I reached up, my fingers brushing the soft skin of my own neck. In the previous life, the steering column had pinned me so hard, my collarbone had shattered into a dozen fragments. David hadn't even come to the morgue to identify my body. He had sent Chloe. The doubt vanished, replaced by a cold, hard clarity that settled in my stomach like a stone. They deserved the wood chipper. I was just turning on the power switch. My phone buzzed in my hand, vibrating violently against my palm. A text from David. David, Mom says you need to come by tomorrow morning. We have some papers for you to sign. Don't make this difficult, Claire. I'm trying to be generous. Generous? I let out a dry, barking laugh that echoed in the empty motel room. I typed a reply. Claire, I'll be there at 10 a.m. I tossed the phone onto the ugly floral bedspread. I needed air. I grabbed my coat and walked out into the biting October wind. The highway was a steady rush of headlights and exhaust fumes. I walked down to the corner gas station, the gravel crunching under my boots. Inside, the clerk was wiping the counter with a dirty rag. The smell of burnt hot dog rollers and stale coffee was oddly comforting. It was real. I bought a black coffee and a stale blueberry muffin, leaning against the cold glass of the storefront window. I watched the cars go by. Tomorrow was Friday, the day of the drawing. They were going to make me sign divorce papers. They wanted a clean break before Monday morning, when the lottery office opened. They wanted to ensure I had absolutely zero legal claim to the $30 million they believed was sitting in Brenda's fake leather purse. I took a bite of the muffin. It was dry and tasted like preservatives, but I chewed it methodically. Let them give me the papers. Let them legally separate our assets just hours before the entire house of cards caught fire. It would save my lawyer a lot of paperwork later. Friday night at 10:55 p.m. The air in the motel room was stifling, the heater rattling loudly in the corner. I sat cross-legged on the floor, directly in front of the boxy television set. The screen was fuzzy, the local news broadcast plagued by a persistent line of static rolling from top to bottom. My heart hammered against my ribs like a trapped bird. My palms were sweating, slick against the rough denim of my jeans. This was the variable. I knew the numbers from my past life, but a dark, irrational part of my brain kept whispering, What if time changed? What if you being here altered the physics of the machine? And now, for the moment you've all been waiting for. The overly tanned lottery announcer smiled, flashing unnaturally white teeth into the camera. The studio lights reflected off the spinning plastic spheres behind him. Tonight's mega draw jackpot sits at a staggering $32 million. The machine engaged. The balls tumbled in a chaotic frenzy. The clattering sound was deafening through the cheap TV speakers. Pop, the first ball, rolled down the chute. Our first number is 08. I stopped breathing. Pop. 14. My fingers dug into the carpet fibers. Pop. 22. Pop. 39. Pop. 41. The announcer paused for dramatic effect, the red mega ball machine spinning wildly. I closed my eyes. 7. Give me a 7. And the mega ball is 07. If you hold these numbers, you are our newest multi-millionaire. A long, ragged exhale shuddered out of my lungs. I collapsed onto my back, staring up at the water-stained popcorn ceiling. It was real. The timeline hadn't shifted. The numbers were exactly the same. Beside me, my phone lit up. It didn't buzz once. It buzzed continuously, a frantic, vibrating seizure on the floorboards. I picked it up. A voicemail from David. I pressed play, holding the speaker an inch from my ear. The background noise was a chaotic symphony of screaming, glass breaking, and blaring pop music. "Claire!" David screamed into the microphone, his voice completely unhinged. He sounded drunk, delirious, entirely detached from gravity. "We did it. We're rich. Mom just checked the ticket. 30 million, Claire. 30 million. You should have treated her better, you stupid bitch. You're getting nothing. Nothing." The line clicked dead. A slow, vicious smile stretched across my face. I couldn't help it. The sheer, intoxicating irony of it was a drug. They were celebrating a piece of porous paper I had defaced with a hobby knife in a bodega parking lot. My phone dinged again. A text from Chloe. "Chloe, sucks to be you, LOL, have fun at the Motel 6 forever." I tossed the phone aside and stood up. I walked into the tiny, dingy bathroom and turned on the sink. The pipes groaned, spitting out lukewarm water. I splashed it on my face, washing away the cold sweat of anticipation. I looked at myself in the mirror. The dark circles under my eyes were still there, but the exhausted victim I had seen a week ago was gone. The woman staring back at me was dangerous. The next morning, I drove to the duplex. The sky was a pale, bruised gray, threatening rain. I parked on the street. The driveway was blocked by a brand new charcoal gray Mercedes G-Wagon. It didn't even have license plates yet, just a dealership tag flapping in the wind. I stared at it. That had to be an $80,000 down payment alone, easily eating up whatever remained of the fraudulent loans Brenda had taken out. I walked up the cracked concrete path. The front yard, usually just dead grass in weeds, was littered with empty champagne bottles and confetti. I didn't knock. I used my key and pushed the front door open. The apartment smelled like stale alcohol, expensive cigars, and vomit. The living room was a disaster zone. Half-eaten takeout containers from a 5-star steakhouse littered the coffee table. Designer clothes, with the tags still on, were thrown over the backs of the kitchen chairs. Brenda was sitting at the dining table, wearing dark sunglasses indoors. She had a bottle of Advil in one hand and a glass of flat mimosa in the other. When she saw me, her lips curled into a nasty, triumphant sneer. Well, well, look what the cat dragged in, she croaked, rubbing her temples. Keep your voice down. We have terrible hangovers. David emerged from the kitchen, looking pale and bloated. He was wearing a silk designer bathrobe. You're late. Traffic, I said simply, stepping over a discarded Jimmy Choo shoebox. You said you had papers. David practically threw a thick manila folder onto the table. It slid across the wood and stopped in front of me. Sign them, right at the bottom. It's a standard uncontested divorce. You keep your car, I keep my assets. We waive alimony. I looked at the folder. Your assets? I asked, feigning bitterness. Brenda laughed, a sharp, coughing sound that ended in a groan of pain. That's right, honey. We don't owe you a dime. Read the fine print. Any future inheritances or lottery winnings are strictly sole property. We filed it fast track. You sign it, the lawyer submits it Monday morning, and you are officially cut out of the family. Any future inheritances or lottery winnings are strictly sole property. They really thought of everything. Or rather, they thought of the one thing that mattered to them. They were legally isolating themselves with the fake ticket, accidentally putting a massive, impenetrable firewall between me and the catastrophic debt they had just accumulated. And the loans? I asked softly. The ones you took out on this house, in my name? David rolled his eyes, exasperated. God, Claire, you are so poor-minded. I'll write a check on Monday to clear the house debt before they even process the paperwork. Just sign the damn divorce papers so we never have to look at your miserable face again. I picked up the pen resting on top of the folder. It was a Mont Blanc, probably cost $600. The metal felt heavy and cool in my fingers. I looked at David. I looked at Brenda. I wanted to sear this exact moment into my memory. The arrogance, the absolute, unshakable certainty that they had won. Okay, I said. I clicked the pen. I signed my name in a smooth, steady loop. 3 signatures. 1 on the property waiver, 1 on the uncontested dissolution, 1 on the final decree. I slid the folder back to David. He snatched it up like it was a gold bar, a greedy, manic grin spreading across his face. Get your remaining junk out of the bathroom and leave, Brenda ordered, taking a sip of her flat mimosa. The movers are coming Monday afternoon to pack up the kitchen. Monday, I repeated, standing up. Monday is going to be a big day for you, Brenda. The biggest, she agreed, tapping her fake leather purse sitting securely on the table beside her. I could see the faint outline of the crease I had made in the ticket through the cheap material. I didn't say another word. I turned and walked out of the duplex, out past the unpaid G-Wagon and into my old Honda Civic. I shut the door. I locked it. And then, for the first time since I woke up from a fatal car crash, smelling burnt toast, I put my head against the steering wheel and laughed until tears streamed down my face. The weekend stretched out like a rubber band, pulled tight, humming with unbearable tension. I spent Saturday and Sunday anchored to the lumpy motel mattress, surrounded by crumpled fast food wrappers and the pervasive smell of stale chlorine from the empty courtyard pool outside. The heavy blackout curtains remained drawn, blocking out the harsh daylight, turning my room into a dusty, timeless purgatory. My only tether to the outside world was the glowing, cracked screen of my phone. I didn't want to look. A part of me wanted to turn the device off, throw it into the motel dumpster, and just drive until my gas tank ran dry. But I couldn't. It was a compulsion, dark and sticky. I had to watch them dig the grave. I opened Instagram. Chloe's profile, usually private, was suddenly public, broadcasting their delusions of grandeur to anyone who would look. Saturday, 2:15 p.m. A video of Chloe and Brenda at a high-end spa downtown. Brenda was wearing a plush white robe, cucumbers over her eyes, a glass of champagne resting on a teak tray beside her. The caption, "Treating the Queen. Should generational wealth. Upgrades." Saturday, 8:30 p.m. A photo of a massive tomahawk steak at a restaurant where I knew the appetizers started at $50. David was in the background, a newly purchased Rolex, glinting obnoxiously in the dim, moody lighting. Sunday, 11 a.m. The G-Wagon parked on the sweeping circular driveway of an open house in the hills. Modern glass, infinity pool, overlooking the city smog. Closing tomorrow. New address, who dis? I stared at the screen until my eyes burned, and the text blurred into meaningless gray lines. My stomach churned, a volatile mixture of greasy French fries and pure, concentrated anxiety. $50,000 in fraudulent loans wasn't enough to fund this bender. They had to be maxing out their own credit lines, too, riding the high of the impending Monday payout. Every swipe of a platinum card, every signature on a lease agreement, was predicated on a piece of paper I had doctored with a $4 hobby knife. I dropped the phone onto the carpet and rubbed my face. My hands were shaking, not with excitement, but with a bone-deep, rattling exhaustion. This wasn't a movie. I wasn't wearing a sleek black dress, sipping scotch while watching my enemies burn on a giant monitor. I was wearing the same sweatpants I had slept in for 3 days, smelling like cheap motel soap, terrified of what would happen if the fragile architecture of my plan collapsed. What if the lottery commission didn't immediately call the police? What if David somehow pinned the forged ticket on me? Stop it, I told myself. Breathe. I forced myself up, walking into the tiny bathroom, to splash cold water on my face. The pipes rattled in the wall. I looked in the mirror. I looked ragged, but the fear in my eyes was different now. It wasn't the paralyzing, suffocating fear of being trapped in Brenda's sticky, cigarette-stained kitchen. It was the sharp, metallic fear of walking a tightrope. Sunday evening, my inbox pinged. An email from David's lawyer, a sleazy strip mall attorney who clearly charged by the hour and asked 0 ethical questions. Subject: Final decree. Dissolution of marriage. Attachments. Signed. Waivers. Claire. PDF. Expedited filing confirmation. PDF. The text was brief. David had paid an exorbitant premium to have a judge review and stamp the uncontested divorce papers in an emergency Sunday session. A favor called in by a lawyer, greased with the promise of a massive Monday bonus. I downloaded the PDF. There it was, the blue digital stamp from the county clerk. Marriage dissolved. Mutual waiver of assets and debts. I let out a breath I felt like I had been holding since the car crash. It was done. Legally, David and I were strangers. His debts, his sudden influx of fraudulent loans, his impending legal catastrophe, they were severed from me, locked behind a firewall of his own arrogant construction. I slept, for the first time in a week, deep, heavy, and dreamless. Monday morning dawned crisp and bitterly cold. The sky a brilliant, unforgiving blue. I was in the lobby of the First National Bank when the heavy glass doors unlocked at exactly 8:30 a.m. I wore a conservative beige trench coat, my hair pulled back into a neat, professional bun. I didn't look like a battered wife or a motel drifter. I looked like a woman with her paperwork in order. The bank manager, a balding man named Mr. Henderson, looked bored until I slid the manila folder across his polished mahogany desk. I need to report severe financial fraud, immediately freeze a home equity line of credit, and initiate an identity theft protocol on my account, I said. My voice was steady, perfectly modulated. He blinked, sitting up straighter, his bureaucratic lethargy evaporating. Excuse me, Ms. It's just Claire now, I said, handing him the expedited divorce decree, followed by the original deed to the duplex, and finally, the grainy photos I had taken of Brenda's forged loan documents before I left the house. My former mother-in-law, Brenda, and my ex-husband, David, forged my signature to collateralize a property solely in my name for a $50,000 bridge loan last week. I did not authorize this, nor did I receive any of the dispersed funds. Mr. Henderson put on his reading glasses, his brow furrowing as he flipped through the documents. The silence in the office was heavy, broken only by the sharp tick of the grandfather clock in the corner. This is, he swallowed hard, this is a massive breach. If these signatures were forged without a notary present, I'll need to get our fraud department and legal counsel on the phone immediately. We may need to contact law enforcement. I strongly suggest you do, I replied calmly. They are currently spending the dispersed funds. You'll want to mitigate the bank's losses. I spent an hour in that office, signing affidavits, locking down my credit, and watching the bank's internal gears grind to a violent halt as they realized they had handed $50,000 to a woman with no legal right to the collateral. By the time I walked back out into the cold morning air, my financial life was entirely insulated in a protective layer of bureaucratic concrete. It was 9:45 a.m. The state lottery claims office in the city center had opened exactly 45 minutes ago. I sat in my Honda Civic in the bank parking lot, the engine idling. I turned on the heater, letting the dry warmth wash over my numb fingers. I stared at my phone, sitting in the cup holder. I tried to picture it. The three of them, Brenda in her tacky new silk, David in his heavy gold watch, Chloe trailing behind with her phone out to film the whole thing, strutting past the security guards at the claims center, demanding the oversized novelty check, slapping the folded, doctored piece of bodega paper onto the receptionist's desk with all the arrogance of royalty demanding tribute. The phone didn't ring at 9:50 a.m. or 10 a.m. A knot of anxiety tightened in my chest. Had it worked? Had they somehow noticed the scrape marks in the harsh fluorescent lighting of the claims office? Had they bailed before presenting it? At 10:14 a.m., the screen lit up. Incoming call. David. I didn't answer immediately. I let it ring. Once, twice, 3 times. I watched the green and red buttons illuminate the dark interior of the car. I picked it up on the 4th ring, pressing it to my ear, remaining absolutely silent. Claire? The voice on the other end was unrecognizable. It wasn't the cruel, booming voice that had kicked me out of my own home. It was a thin, reedy squeak, the sound of a man who had just stepped off a cliff and finally looked down. Hello, David, I said. My voice was utterly hollow. No gloating, no anger, just a void. Claire, there's a problem. I could hear heavy, panicked breathing in the background. Someone was crying. It sounded like Chloe. The lottery ticket. What about it? It didn't. The machine wouldn't scan it. David's voice cracked, a hysterical edge bleeding into his words. The clerk put it in the scanner, and it threw an error. So they called a supervisor, and they took a magnifying glass to it, Claire. Oh, I murmured, tracing a crack in my steering wheel with my index finger. They said it was altered. They said it's a forgery. A felony forgery. He was hyperventilating now, the words tumbling out of him in a wet, desperate rush. They called security. We're in a back room. They won't let us leave. Mom is screaming. She's telling them it's a mistake. She's telling them you bought it. I close my eyes. The sweet, dark rush of vindication was overwhelming, making me slightly dizzy. She tried to throw me under the bus, just as I knew she would. I didn't buy a winning ticket, David. I bought 5 losing tickets, I said slowly, enunciating every syllable. And I left them in my purse. Where did Brenda get the ticket she handed to the clerk? Dead silence on the line. I could practically hear the gears grinding in his panicked brain, the horrific realization settling in. To accuse me of forgery meant admitting Brenda had stolen the ticket from my closed purse in the middle of the night. You, David choked out. You did this. You knew she would snoop. You set us up. Set you up to do what, David? I asked, dropping the flat affect. A sharp, icy edge crept into my tone. Set you up to steal from me? Set you up to forge my signature on a $50,000 home equity loan? Set you up to kick me out into the street while you bought a Mercedes? We owe them, Claire, he screamed, dropping any pretense of logic. He was a cornered rat. We owe O'Leary Motors. We owe the title loan company $50,000. I put $30,000 on my Amex this weekend. We don't have it. You have to help us. We can fix this. You have to talk to the bank. I already did, I interrupted, cutting through his hysteria like a scalpel. He stopped, gasping for air. What? I filed a police report for the forged deed and the fraudulent equity loan an hour ago, I said, staring out through the windshield at the gray clouds gathering over the city. The bank's fraud department is freezing the accounts right now. You don't just owe them the money, David. You committed mortgage fraud and wire fraud, and now you've just handed a forged lottery ticket to a state official. Claire, please. Oh my God, you're my wife. No, David, I said, looking down at the passenger seat where my copy of the expedited divorce decree sat in its neat manila folder. As of 8 o'clock last night, I am legally nothing to you. You made sure of that. Remember, you fast-tracked it. A guttural, animalistic sound came through the speaker. A sob of pure, unadulterated terror. In the background, I heard the heavy, metallic click of a door opening. A deep voice spoke, a security guard or a police officer ordering them to hang up the phone. Enjoy the mansion, David, I whispered. I ended the call and blocked his number. I sat in the quiet hum of my car, listening to the heater, staring at the empty parking lot. My hands had finally stopped shaking. The following Wednesday, the rain finally broke, leaving the city washed out and gray under a bruised sky. I pulled up to the duplex at noon. I wasn't alone. A squad car idled at the curb, the exhaust pluming in the damp air. Behind it sat a heavy-duty tow truck, its diesel engine rumbling with a deep, mechanical vibration I could feel in my molars. I stepped out of my Honda. My boots crunched over soggy, trampled confetti mashed into the wet grass. The celebration debris looked pathetic now, like the aftermath of a cheap carnival. Officer Miller, a stocky man with a graying mustache who had taken my statement at the precinct, nodded to me. Ready, Miss Claire? Yes, I said. We walked up the concrete path. The front door was ajar, the lock splintered. The bank's repo men hadn't been gentle when they came for the collateral. The smell hit me before I even crossed the threshold. The stale cigar smoke and spilled alcohol from Saturday had fermented in the enclosed space, creating a thick, rancid odor that coated the back of my throat like a film. It smelled like rot, like consequence. Inside, the living room was a battlefield of panic. Drawers were pulled entirely out of their tracks, dumped onto the stained carpet. The designer shopping bags that had littered the room just days ago were violently torn open. In the center of the mess sat Chloe. She was sitting cross-legged on the floor, clutching a beige Prada handbag to her chest. Her spray tan was streaked with tracks of black mascara, giving her the appearance of a deranged raccoon. She was frantically scrolling through her phone, her thumbs moving at lightning speed, muttering under her breath. "They won't take it back without the receipt," she sobbed, to no one in particular. "I used my own card for the shoes. David said he'd wire me the cash Monday. He swore." I watched her for a long moment. I had expected a surge of adrenaline, a victorious rush of dopamine, but standing there in my damp coat, looking at the wreckage of my former life, I just felt a heavy, hollow exhaustion. "Chloe," I said. My voice sounded flat in the ruined room. She snapped her head up. When she saw me, her face contorted from despair to a frantic, grasping rage. She scrambled to her feet, dropping the bag. "You!" she shrieked, pointing a trembling finger at me. "You set them up. Mom called me from county lockup. She told me what you did. You switched the ticket." "I didn't switch anything," I said calmly, stepping aside as Officer Miller moved into the room. "I kept my property in my purse. Your mother chose to go looking for it. I can't help what she thought she found." "You ruined us!" Chloe screamed, taking a step forward before the officer raised a hand, stopping her in her tracks. "David's accounts are frozen. The bank called me because I'm listed as his emergency contact. They're foreclosing on the mansion. The dealership is pressing charges for the bounced deposit." Outside, a loud, metallic clang echoed through the open door. The tow truck operator was securing heavy chains to the axles of the charcoal G-Wagon. The sound was harsh, industrial, and utterly final. "You ruined yourselves," I replied. The absolute truth of it tasted like cold iron on my tongue. "You took a $50,000 loan out on a house I paid for. You maxed out credit cards you stole from my bedroom. You thought you were invincible because you held a piece of paper." I looked around the room, taking in the cheap linoleum, the peeling wallpaper, the water-stained ceiling. "This is my property," I told Officer Miller, not breaking eye contact with Chloe. "She doesn't live here. She's trespassing." Chloe's jaw dropped. She looked at the cop, then back at me, waiting for the punchline. There wasn't one. "Ma'am, I'm going to need you to gather your personal effects and vacate the premises," Miller said, his tone bored and bureaucratic. "I have nowhere to go," Chloe wailed, her bravado shattering into pathetic, wet sobs. "My apartment lease ended on the 1st. We were supposed to move to the hills. There's a Motel 6 on Highway 40, I suggested softly. Room 12 is available. The neon sign keeps you awake, but the coffee at the gas station next door isn't terrible." I walked into the kitchen, leaving her crying in the living room. I ran the tap, watching the rusty water turn clear. I listened to the chains dragging outside, dragging their delusions down the driveway and out of my life. 2 months later, mid-December, the county courthouse possessed a very specific, inescapable climate. It smelled distinctly of damp wool coats, industrial lemon floor wax, and the sour, pervasive stench of nervous sweat that decades of scrubbing couldn't quite pull from the porous brick walls. I sat in Gallery B. The wooden bench was unforgiving, a solid block of heavily varnished oak that dug a dull ache into the base of my spine. I forced myself to sit perfectly straight, my hands folded quietly in my lap. I didn't have to be here. Legally, my presence was entirely unnecessary. My lawyer had already secured the civil judgments weeks ago. The bank had officially dropped me from their sweeping fraud investigation the exact moment the state's handwriting analysis confirmed I hadn't signed a single page of those loan documents. My credit was locked down, my assets were insulated, and my name was scrubbed from their mess. But I needed to see it. My brain, still occasionally haunted by the metallic crunch of a semi-truck from a timeline that no longer existed, demanded sensory confirmation. I needed to watch the dirt fall on the grave. The heavy, brass-studded oak doors beside the judge's bench swung open. The hinges let out a low, mechanical groan. David walked out first, flanked by a massive bailiff whose hand hovered casually over a holstered taser. I almost didn't recognize my ex-husband. He was wearing an oversized county-issue orange jumpsuit that hung off his frame like a deflated balloon. He looked incredibly small. The bloated, manic arrogance of the man who had stood in my living room in a silk designer bathrobe, demanding I pack my bags, was entirely gone. It had been replaced by a hollow-eyed, shuffling shell. His hairline looked like it had receded another inch just in the last 60 days. His hair was greasy, plastered flat against his pale skull under the harsh, buzzing fluorescent lights. He kept rubbing his wrists, his eyes darting wildly around the room, taking in the wood paneling, the judge, the flag, but never settling on anything. He looked terrified. He looked exactly like the weak, pathetic man I had spent years making excuses for. Brenda was let out a moment later. If David looked small, Brenda looked entirely broken. The transformation was jarring. Without her daily box of cheap white Zinfandel, her suffocating synthetic orchid perfume, and her freshly painted acrylic nails, she was just a frail, bitter old woman facing the end of her life. Her hair, which she had meticulously dyed a harsh, brassy blonde for a decade, was showing 3 inches of stark, wiry white roots. She kept her head down, her shoulders hunched. When she moved, the heavy metal chains secured around her waist clinked against the cuffs on her wrists. The sound was sharp and rhythmic. Clink, step, clink, step. They were seated at the defense table, mere feet away from each other. They didn't speak. They didn't even make eye contact. The fierce, toxic familial loyalty they had paraded around, like an impenetrable shield, had evaporated the very second the state investigators started dangling 20-year mandatory minimums in their faces. According to the public docket I had read online, David's overworked public defender was building a case claiming Brenda had emotionally manipulated and coerced him into the mortgage fraud. Brenda's lawyer, equally exhausted, was claiming David had forged the lottery ticket and forced his elderly mother to cash it. Rats in a drowning barrel, violently climbing over each other, just to steal one more breath of air. The judge, an older woman with a face like carved granite and zero patience in her posture, leaned into her microphone. Her voice bounced off the high, acoustically dead ceiling, flat and devoid of any emotion. The defendants are facing multiple felony counts: conspiracy to commit wire fraud, first-degree mortgage fraud, forgery of a state document, grand larceny. The prosecutor, a young man in a sharp blue suit, stood up to outline the financial reality of the defendants for the court record. It was an absolute bloodbath. I listened to him list the numbers, feeling a strange, detached numbness wash over me. Between the predatory title loan on the duplex, the bounced luxury dealership deposits, the moving company they had hired and stiffed, the maxed-out credit cards, and the rapidly accumulating legal fees, David and Brenda were staring down a crater of over $130,000 in high-interest debt. They weren't just going to a physical prison. They were going to a financial graveyard. Even if they took plea deals, even if they somehow got out in 5 or 7 years, they were ruined. Their wages would be garnished into oblivion to pay back the state and the bank's restitution. They would never own a car, sign a lease on a decent apartment, or hold a credit card again. They had built their own cage, welded the bars with their own insatiable greed, and I had simply handed them the lock. Brenda slowly turned her head, the movement stiff and painful, scanning the gallery behind her. Her eyes, roomy and rimmed with a sickly red, locked onto mine in the back row. I didn't smile. I didn't scowl. I didn't offer her a smug, victorious sneer. I just looked back at her, feeling absolutely nothing. The terrifying, looming monster who had haunted my previous life. The woman who had watched me bleed out on the asphalt and smiled while clutching my winning ticket was gone. She didn't exist anymore. Sitting in that chair was just a pathetic thief in an itchy, ill-fitting jumpsuit. Brenda's lower lip trembled. A muscle in her jaw ticked violently. She looked away first, staring down at her shackled, liver-spotted hands resting on the defense table. I didn't stay for the rest of the hearing. I didn't need to hear the gavel fall. I stood up, the wooden bench creaking slightly beneath my weight, and pushed my way through the heavy double doors, stepping out into the hallway. The cold winter air hit my face the moment I pushed through the courthouse's main exit. It was sharp, biting, and incredibly clean, stripping the smell of floor wax and stale sweat from my lungs. I walked down the concrete steps toward the street. I had sold the duplex 3 weeks ago to a commercial developer who planned to bulldoze it to the ground. With the equity I rightfully owned, I had rented a small, quiet, 1-bedroom apartment on the far west side of the city. It had real hardwood floors, no sticky linoleum, no lingering smell of burnt toast or cheap aerosol spray. I stopped at a small corner cafe at the end of the block and bought a black coffee. Real, expensive dark roast. I held the ribbed paper cup in both hands, letting the intense heat seep into my freezing skin. I took a slow sip. It was bitter, complex, and perfect. I didn't have $30 million. I didn't have a modern glass mansion in the hills or a ridiculous gold watch. But I had my name. I had my quiet, undisturbed mornings. I had a locked door that only I held the key to. I turned up the collar of my beige coat and walked down the sidewalk, blending seamlessly into the rush hour crowd. Just another woman going about her Friday. And for the first time in 2 lifetimes, I was finally, truly awake. And that is how you dismantle toxic in-laws, without ever breaking the law yourself. Brenda and David chased a delusion straight into a concrete cell and a lifetime of garnished wages. Have you ever had to cut off a toxic family member to save your own sanity? How did you do it? Let me know down in the comments. Your stories are always wilder than fiction. If you loved watching this arrogant family get exactly what they deserved, hit that like button, share this video with a friend who loves sweet revenge, and subscribe for more deep dive karma stories.